So here we are again. We're headed into 2025, which is unbelievable to me, quite frankly. But we're starting a new year. And starting a new year, I think for me, it's given me pause to reflect on the last few years and more about how I want to step into this coming year. And so I couldn't think of a better person to start this year off with, honestly, than Melissa Engle, who totally adore. We had a great conversation a couple months ago. And just, she's been in this field for a long, long, long time, still at it, still bringing the passion, still continuing to unwrap dynamics of what's happening here and learn things anew. And is the COO of Healing Springs Ranch out of Texas. And
well, let me clarify.
Yeah.
I'm actually the executive clinical director of programming. So I'm over the clinical programming at Healing Springs.
Okay. Anyway, my take on Melissa is she's extraordinary. And I wanted to give her an opportunity to join us today. And really what we were talking about a little bit before we got on was this whole notion of multigenerational addiction, multigenerational patterns of behavior. And for me, it was definitely multigenerational. And I think that it would be important to just kind of wade into this topic for our listeners.
Absolutely. I have been doing this long enough. I think I added up. I think we're going on 37 years now. I've been doing this for a while. So I think when I look back over the last almost 4 decades, I can actually remember when I worked in a private psychiatric hospital fresh out of college, we were specifically instructed not to ask our clients anything about trauma. But so we don't want to stir up anything. We want to settle them down. And so it was like a forbidden topic, which just kind of cracks me up because it's like, that's the root issue, right? So we had to work around not upsetting the apple cart or upsetting folks. And then give it a couple of decades later, then you started hearing about trauma informed. And so that started kind of making its way in. And even trauma informed can be very limiting. It's just like we're helping people understand that trauma has some kind of impact. But for me, when you're dealing with chronic addictions and chronic mental health, you need to really it's more about trauma resolution. And it's not just about understanding it, but actually getting in touch with that pain that has been so suppressed. Because it's the suppression of the pain that causes the chemical changes in our bodies that can be a part of the epigenetics when we start looking at chronic addictions and chronic mental health struggles.
Can you say a little bit for our audience about epigenetics and how this plays a role?
Yeah, that's really just kind of starting to recognize, when I was growing up, it was like the genes you're born with, they turn on, they turn off. There's nothing you can do about it. And it's all driven by your DNA and it's something outside of your control, and environment doesn't really have anything to do with it. But what we're learning now is that the environment itself has a lot to do with who we are genetically. And that how we interface with our environment can create chemical reactions. And those chemical reactions can actually change the DNA. So we're learning that old saying, nature versus nurture. And when I was in school, we were taught it's nature is very big. And good grief, nurturing the environment was very small. And then genetically, your nature was the big thing. And so we just hoped people would take their medication, do what they needed to do. There's really not a lot that you can do, especially for what people consider the more serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar. And we just really hope they take their medication and just hope for the best because they've got some bad genes and there's just really nothing you can do about it. Right. But what we're learning now, and the way I've really worked with people for so many years, is recognizing that environment shapes us and sets us up. And there's tons of studies that even show this starts in the womb. And they have compared people who have experienced PTSD during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy and the impact that has on the birth weight of the babies. And so there are some direct correlations with the effect of trauma and PTSD on the baby that's growing inside its mother's womb. And another thing that was so interesting to me is if the mother is pregnant with a little girl, when we're growing in our mother's womb, we have all the eggs that we're going to have for our entire life. Our body doesn't produce eggs. We are developing and we're born with all the eggs we're ever going to have. And so people have talked about, when your grandmother was pregnant with her child and half of you anyway, because the baby she's carrying had the eggs. So they're even saying that some of the studies are saying that the trauma that the baby has, depending on the mother's trauma, can actually even be expressed in that unborn baby's body to her developing egg. So they're even starting to kind of link the epigenetics.
Mhm.
And epigenetics is just kind of like the validation of what I was seeing in my private practice and all the years at Healing Springs and been working with people, because I would get people into, I've been doing this long enough that I'm seeing now a lot of times the grandchildren. And so I've been able to see a lot of patterns,
Mhm.
and it will happen where family members will be like, the mother will say, but I never talked to her about that. I never told her about that. So
Mhm.
how is she being impacted by stuff the same way I was when I've never shared this with her? And so I had been seeing that over the years, but then to start seeing the research supporting what you've seen from a more of a
Mhm.
scientific perspective is
Yeah.
really kind of cool and validating.
Right. I think there's so much to all of this. And I think it's really, really helpful it was for me, and I'm assuming our audience too, to understand that there's more at play here than what we think. There's
Absolutely.
more to understand about the disease, substance use disorder. And, you and I talked last time, we focus on the behavior
Mhm.
instead of the underlying trauma. And now,
Yes.
we're kind of expanding that in this discussion in terms of understanding the multi-generational trauma.
Well, that, and we're also kind of expanding our understanding of trauma. Because
Mhm.
for so long, we would just kind of attribute trauma to, and they even sort of saying things like big T, little t, trying to distinguish between sexual abuse, physical abuse. And then you have something called the ACEs study, which is
Mhm.
Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. And I prefer that adverse childhood experiences because a lot of people don't even refer to what they went through as trauma, or they'll
Right.
say, well, what I went through is not anything like this person over
Mhm.
here.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of comparisons.
Mhm.
But when you start talking about adverse childhood experiences, that's all of us have had adverse childhood experiences. So it kind of normalizes it and helps people realize, oh, I didn't even realize, I never even thought about my parents being divorced as an adverse experience that I may still struggle with on some levels.
Mhm.
So we're not only broadening our definition of trauma, but we're looking at the unresolved effects of trauma. And I'll split that here even one more time. It's not even necessarily the trauma itself, because I have people who the trauma happened 20 years ago. So
Mhm.
the trauma itself is not actually an issue because there's no threat or danger currently, and it's been years ago.
Right.
It's actually how that person responded to that trauma, and were they able to process out of their body those
Mhm.
feelings that
Mhm.
can get stored. So
Mhm.
for me, the biggest culprit for chronic addictions and multi-generational patterns
Mhm.
is a pattern of emotional suppression. And
Yeah.
if you have a pattern of stuffing things down, that energy of those emotions being held into your body, the body keeps the score, right? This is
Mhm.
vessel
Mhm.
stuff. When
Mhm.
you hold that stuff in your body, that energy changes who we are chemically, which can have an effect on our expression of certain DNA or certain DNA expression. So
Mhm.
it all goes together, but it starts with chronic suppression of very painful things and not ever dealing with it.
Right. Right. And so I not only think about this obviously through the lens of loving someone who's dealing with substance use disorder, but I also think about it when I see on Facebook some of the groups in terms of the parents' response, the friends' response, and how do we also understand our own journey in this? And what I was thinking about earlier is this podcast is called Thrive While Loving an Addict. How do we actually even entertain the notion thriving while we love somebody who's dealing with substance use disorder?
I think just understanding that the root of substance use disorder, chronic substance use disorder, I think understanding that your loved one is more than their behaviors
Hmm.
and that there's always an underlying reason. And a lot of times people think, well, just make a different choice. Just don't do that anymore. But the part of the brain that registers physical pain doesn't know the difference between physical pain and emotional pain. And we would never really, I think, show fault or be upset with someone who is in tremendous emotional or physical pain, wanting a painkiller, wanting desperately take. I mean, if someone has a car wreck and their legs broken, you're like, oh my gosh, get on morphine, do whatever. That looks terrible. But you have to understand that when people are in such emotional pain themselves, there becomes a desperate attempt to medicate that emotional pain, especially if the brain doesn't know the difference. And so I think having a better understanding that the addiction is an effort to numb out unbearable pain that has been suppressed. I think just having an awareness deeper than the behavior will give us more tolerance, more compassion, more understanding. It's a different mindset when you look at the behavior as a symptom of an underlying issue, as
Right.
opposed to just focusing on the behavior. When I train staff and work with people, just kind of having that mindset can really shift inside of you the relatability, because now whether you can relate to the substance or not, you can definitely relate to, man, I know what it's like to really be in a lot of pain emotionally. I know what it's like to grieve someone that you've lost. I know what it's like to feel betrayed. Now we can relate to our loved one more. And quite often that in and of itself is so healing. And it gives you a little bit of a different perspective. And if you see it that way you help is going to be different too. Because the way we help is going to come from a place of compassion and connection and understanding, as opposed to judgment or even self-blame. Like, what did I do wrong? And I've had many parents that have said, holy cow, I never understood that the way I was dealing with my feelings wasn't the healthiest. And I'm learning how to do that better now. And I think maybe my loved one and I both are going to have to work on how to manage our feelings better. What is a healthy way of dealing with feelings? Because I think I kind of accidentally taught them unhealthy ways. And that doesn't have to be critical or blaming. It's just, we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And so shifting the understand the viewpoint from which we come from instead of the blame or blaming ourselves or looking at the behaviors, the lying, the manipulation, all of those kinds of things, and shifting to and understanding that there's tremendous pain that is the driving force. And in some respects, most people are kind of hijacked by their pain.
Yes.
And then actually, my understanding is their brain gets hijacked, certainly by the chemicals, but also I think there's a hijacking that takes place, a rewiring of our brains through trauma.
Oh, yes. And there's a lot of studies that talk about, they can see like there's certain parts of the brain, the amygdala, there's different parts of the brain that are smaller because of trauma. And trauma absolutely affects the anatomy of our brain. Which, when I was growing up, when I was in school, it was like, man, you don't want to lose any neurons because those suckers don't come back. You got what you got. Don't lose those guys. But what we're learning is what neuroplasticity, and we're learning about how the mind, the way we think, can actually heal our brain. It can change our brain. It can change the anatomy. So places that were smaller and more atrophied, when you do different types of integrative type therapies, you actually are creating new neuronal connections. And you do that enough, there's actually an increase in the size of those parts of the brain. So, I mean, the field doesn't have enough money. Like before people come to Healing Springs, they get an MRI and they could see all the areas of the brain, or they could get a PET scan and see what areas are lit up. And then after 6 weeks of treatment, get another MRI, because now we're up to like $4,000 in MRIs, right? But the science is there now. You can actually show, and they have proven, that the way you change your thinking and the way you choose to manage your emotions, which is also a way of managing yourself chemically, because the way we respond emotionally, direct effect on our chemistry in our body.
Right.
And when we change the way we think and we learn how to get these feelings out of our body and that we've stored, that we've suppressed, all this pain, and then we learn new healthy coping mechanisms, people's brains are absolutely changing. There's activity in areas where it wasn't there before. They're not going into the fight or flight response. So their adrenaline and their cortisol levels are starting to level out. So there's not all these crazy chemicals going on in your body. And the parts of the brain that needed more connections are connecting. There's new synapses. There's new neuronal pathways. And the brain actually in those areas get bigger. Which
Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
It's totally amazing. I mean, for me, that was one of the things that I began to understand that gave me so much hope, not only for Sam's journey, but for mine.
Yes.
Because I come from multi-generational trauma and substance use. And so I was like, I used to think way back, long time ago when I was growing up, that this was just the way I was going to be.
Yes. That's where sometimes the disease model can create a dynamic that I don't think people intend or mean for it to. But the disease model itself, when the people hear disease model and they think, DNA, genetics. This is just who I am. And it can be very liberating for people to realize, because I've had people say to me in my private practice and at Healing Springs, I don't want to have kids because I'm afraid I'm going to pass this bad gene on. And so for them to learn and to feel empowered that they can actually change their body and even their genetic expression by learning some new ways of managing their emotion and by changing the way that they think. I mean, that's incredibly powerful. I mean, and you can expand this on and on and on, because that could also mean as you make these changes chemically, your physical health can improve too, because mental and physical are all together. So I love that we're finally coming into a time where you don't just have to think about your medical doctor over here and your psychiatrist, or your psychologist or counselor over here. We know that mind and body is connected, but unfortunately the way we have treated those have been so separated in silos. And to realize now, gosh, I can help a lot of these physical symptoms by helping them deal with this traumatic, unresolved emotional pain. And I mean, it goes both ways. If we're sick for a long time physically, you can get depressed. I mean, your physical body breaking down can affect you emotionally, and your mind, your emotional side, mental health breaking down can affect your body. Stress affects our bodies. So it is very exciting times, I think.
Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I do think the unpacking of new understandings around all of this is relieving to some extent and so life-giving in other ways. And we can change.
The irony behind that is sometimes people, even hearing this, it scares them. Sometimes it's easier to believe I'm broken and damaged beyond repair. And then we kind of get in that self-fulfilling prophecy. It's just like us being loved ones on the outside, loving someone who you're watching kind of circle the drain. When we blame ourselves, it's okay to be hurt and scared. But quite often what happens is the reason we'll blame ourselves as the caregivers is because it prevents us from having to feel helpless. And it helps us to not, it's easier to beat up blame self and kind of just keep yourself in the space where you're ruminating on, would have, should have, could have. But what that actually does is it prevents us from just accepting that we're helpless to this. In the big picture, we have to accept that we can't control everything, but the things we can control. When I teach families, here's what we can do. You can be a role model for healthy emotional expression. You can be a safe place for your child to say, Mom, I never told anybody this, and I need to talk about it now, and be able to sit with them and help them learn that you're a safe place to be able to express this stuff. I've had daddies who have said, I told my kid for years, he needed to just suck it up. And he said, so I'm going to have to totally change that and sit with him in that space and allow him to feel that. And I have watched mamas and daddies and their kids are in their 50s and their 60s. I've worked with all kinds of families and the healing that can still take place. So I want families not to feel, they have to accept they don't have control over what their loved one does. And they don't have to get stuck in helplessness. I'd rather teach them some new skills that's going to cause them to feel vulnerable, but I don't want them to feel helpless, because there's things we can do now. And we can't control another person, but we sure can set the stage for a new way of relating, a new way of talking, a new way of expressing our emotions. And we can do this together as a family. And it's not just on the identified patient, because we all have room to grow and evolve and to become healthier humans mentally and physically and spiritually.
Yeah. And there's a couple things that are going on in my head because you always get me thinking. One is that we can learn these patterns of helplessness. And in some respects, even though it's convoluted, it serves us in some form or fashion. And so the way that I think about this is this disease, if we're going to grapple with somebody loving someone who is dealing with substance use disorder, is an open opportunity for us to do our own work.
You bet. And that, while you were talking, I was thinking too, because that brings us back to the multi-generational patterns, right? So it's an opportunity. I mean, I have so many clients that will come in, they'll come to Healing Springs and I'll say, well, let's reach out to your family. Like, oh, no, they won't change. They're not interested in hearing anything. I'm like, wouldn't you be amazed? So there's so many families that when we start talking about it, it healed layers. And I'll tell the client, you may be the identified client coming in here, but as you share, and we'll do like a genogram where we start looking at patterns of mental illness in the family, patterns of trauma, and you'll just hear tons and tons of trauma. And it goes back we go back to their grandparents and we look for patterns. And then a lot of times we'll get mom in and she can go back to her grandparents and you can still see those patterns. And they water down a little each time. But we have an opportunity exponentially speed up that process and completely change, be the agent of change for these dynamics. We don't have to water them down again. They stop.
Right.
So families feel a huge relief knowing that that's something that they can do. And it does help. While we're working with this client, I've seen so many families heal their own wounds that they thought they were hiding and masking so well. And so many families will say, well, I thought I was coming here to support him, but I had no idea all this stuff was going to come up for me. And I feel so much better getting this out.
Yeah, I would say that's been my journey. There have been so many things that even recently doing energy work around the release of, I had a brother who was very ill as a child. And because he was put into clinical trials and he was little and so on and so forth, he was subjected to all kinds of things.
Yes.
He became super angry. And there was no place else other than me in our growing up where I think he could bring it and let it go. And so, I had a couple situations where he tried to kill me. And it wasn't until I hadn't thought about it until like recently, but it kind of started bubbling up. I was like, oh, there you are again. Okay, well, we're going to release you because I'm not hanging on to this. At this stage of the game.
We don't even realize, I think I mentioned this in our talk before, but 20% of the population is a highly sensitive person, which means 80% is not, correct? So when you have these highly sensitive people who feel things more deeply, more intensely, and it's harder to let go of things, when they're talking to an 80%er who's not a highly sensitive person, the 80%er is going to say things like, why can't you just get over it? Let it go. The past is the past. I don't know why you continue to go there. Well, they're wired different. That to me, I think the highly sensitive person, if we're going to talk about more of the kind of the hardwiring DNA stuff, because our temperament, right, and our sensitivity is going to be a little bit more of kind of a genetic expression as we grow and develop. So a lot of times it's highly sensitive people who have had painful experiences that they cram down. And so they've got more packed in there. And then you add trauma, and then you add current day stressors, because everybody, even the 80%ers, everybody has a breaking point. You could stress anybody out enough that they have a breaking point. But if you're highly sensitive, it's probably going to come a little sooner, and you're going to have to work through it more. And just telling someone to quit thinking about it is not going to work for a highly sensitive soul. So a lot of our people that struggle with mental illness, chronic mental illness and chronic addictions are those highly sensitive people. And they just packed a lot in. And a lot of times people are like, well, I don't want to burden anybody by sharing my pain, so they hold it in. Or your family, those old family unspoken rules, or even if they're spoken, if you have, and this is how multi-generational stuff gets passed down too, right? So unspoken family rules about emotional expression. So in some families, it's not okay to get angry. In some families, anger is really rage that's being expressed. In some families, when mom is struggling and feels sad and depressed, she goes, isolates in the room, stops eating, and she holds up and she's over by herself. Those behaviors can also be taught. So if she sees, and if her daughter watches, this is what mom does when she feels overwhelmed, daughter will learn from that, whether mom says it or not. It can go isolate herself when she starts feeling down, thinking she didn't have a right to talk to anybody else about it. And the same is true for great grandpa, who was out working in the fields, and he didn't know if his crop was going to make it to feed his family through the winter. And he was so stressed out, he would drink moonshine just to try to go to sleep. So his son is watching, when you get stressed out, this is what you do. I think we've made a mistake of not thinking a little bit more critically and just assuming that if you see a pattern in families, it has to be genetic. It doesn't even have to be genetic. It can be learned.
Right. And, in my mind, I'm like, I don't know if I believe the quote, it's just genes anymore. Because as you were talking about that, I was thinking about my grandmother. Now, my grandmother on my mom's side was like a mom to me, super, super powerful in my life. But when she would get stressed out, she would get shingles.
Yes.
And then she'd be in bed, or she'd have a migraine. And those two patterns for her were the way. And I haven't done this for a long time. I've never had shingles, but I remember earlier in my life where I would get so overwhelmed, then I would go to bed. And I was just repeating what I saw as a pattern from my
Yes.
grandmother. And, fortunately, I'm just kind of like a dog with a bone. I'm not willing to allow those things to be more in charge. I want to be more the agent of my own life.
Yes.
And so continuing to learn, break the patterns in my DNA, in my head, in my
Yes.
brain, and create new ones that are much more life-giving for me to be able to do the work that I do in the world. And what I also want to say is I am seeing more and more executives in my work that are highly sensitive. And they're coming to me because they've hit the wall, they're in high-powered positions, and they have no idea what to do next. And literally, some of them will cry with me for 6 to 8 months because they just need to be able to release it in a safe space. And then finally, then they're able to, okay, now I can talk about this other stuff.
Yes. Yes. Well, and a lot of these executives that you're talking about, it wouldn't surprise me if they were workaholics in some way.
Mhm.
So if they've stayed up here, because we can run from our emotions when we hold emotions in, when we stuff them down, they go in our bodies. So it doesn't like disappear. They get packed in our bodies. And when you suppress enough pain in your body, your subconscious is going to start building a dam across your neck. So there's going to be bricks that get laid where this and this cannot be connected.
Right.
Because mind and body have to separate because body's got all the pain. And if
Right.
mind and body are working together and like this little circuit between head and heart and head, if this is connected, you'd be connected to the pain. So
Right.
your mind will disconnect and it's denial. So you go up here and you'll say, oh, it's okay. I don't feel anything. I'm fine. It doesn't bother me. And you don't even realize that it's building like a powder keg in your body.
Mhm.
And if you deny your feelings enough, your body will break down. Your
Mhm.
body will start to break down.
Mhm.
So people who are not turn the emotional knob to numb, if they turn it off and say there's nothing going on, their body will rat them out.
Yes. Yeah, that's great.
With people that turn the knob up and get overreactive and very, very take their emotions to a 10 when it needs to be a 5, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when we over respond emotionally, we will disconnect from our logical prefrontal cortex because that's what fight or flight does. So when this turns off, for people who are all in their bodies and they're all over the place, but they're not connected here, their mind will break down. So whatever you're not connected to, whether you don't connect to your body, you're going to see medical symptoms creep up.
Mhm.
If you kind of lose your mind and you're all in your body,
Right.
you're going to see mental or psychiatric symptoms creep up. So it kind of lets me know where a person is at.
Yeah.
And you can tell the people that are a little bit more, you can tell from the way I talk, right? I'm more of a in my body person.
Yes.
And then I have done workshops for years with a psychiatrist that he's like family. I just love him. His name's Colin Ross. And he's all up in his head.
Yeah.
So we would be the perfect team and we'd go present because he would explain everything analytically and then I would do all the expressive experiential stuff. But the truth be told, as clinicians, and we both do this very well, Colin does it too. If he's doing cognitive work, he has to make sure his clients get in touch with the feelings in here. If I'm doing emotional, emotive work, I got to make sure they stay grounded here because whatever side they're not connected to, there's going to be an effect, whether it comes out medically or mentally. It will pop.
Right. Right. Wow. That is so great. I love the way you describe stuff. And so in a layman's way, I have said for years that we basically create these patterns when we're growing up based on trauma that shows up. We choose however we're going to pattern our way in dealing with it. And then mid-30s to 50, we're going to either have an accident or we're going to get sick. And that's our opportunity to deal with the shit.
Yes. Yes. That's why people need to see it as a blessing in disguise, right? Because what the second half of your life, we're going to be healthier.
Right, right, right.
But you actually said something that is, I know it's controversial and I always have to be very careful to tread lightly. When you were saying, when you think about the disease model of addiction, I am so grateful because I know the intention behind that was I believe the intention behind that was to get people off of this moral high horse
Mhm.
where they're judging someone. And it's kind of like saying, well, hang on a minute. Would you judge someone that had cancer? So it was an effort. And we were calling it a disease model before we really even had the science to try to back it up. The model, I think, is a brilliant effort to help people understand the loss of control and the depths of pain that person's in, and for people not to judge that. So that's
Mhm.
beautiful. But what it can do, like you touched on earlier, is it unfortunately can kind of tip the scale what people think. I'm just broken. This is who I am. I shouldn't have children. And so they feel like a victim to their genes, and they just
Mhm.
got the short stick in the draw, right?
Mhm.
So the research, and this is something that Dr. Ross talks about quite a bit, the National Institute of Health no longer funds any kind of research project to find the gene behind depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, or addictions. They don't even fund it anymore because it's like,
Mhm.
let's not even put our money to try to find the gene
Mhm.
for any of the DSM diagnoses. It's a waste of time because we're
Right.
learning that the genes that come into play with those 4 diagnoses, it's like it started out like 200. And now I think it's up to like they recognize at least 1,000 different genes at play. And when you're looking at 1,000 different genes at play, we're looking at a crossover of environment and chemistry and DNA. It's all mixed up there together. So there's no
Mhm.
single gene theory anymore. That just
Mhm.
isn't true. There's
Mhm.
so many genes at play. And now we're learning you can turn your genes off and on by your environment. So for us to have this single threaded, it's just in our genes, while I appreciate the intent, the science just doesn't really support that anymore.
Right.
But that's okay because the wonderful thing is we're learning we don't have to be totally helpless to our genetic expression. There are things we can do that influence and affect us, starting with how do I affect in a good way my chemistry, chemically. And the way we think directly affects our chemical. The things we eat is we get exercise. I mean, there's a whole
Mhm.
lot of things out there that can help us be a healthy person. So we do have options. We're not
Mhm.
just having to sit back and wait for the bad gene to kick in and kill us. We have
Mhm.
options for things we can do to encourage and promote health and healing at a physical, mental, gene, chemical, spiritual level.
Absolutely. So I was remembering this was quite a while ago, 23 years ago, 24 years ago, I got thyroid cancer.
I
And my dad had had cancer of the larynx. And as soon as it showed up, I went, oh, I have stuffed my voice and things you normally do. At the same time, I started doing acupuncture and energy work, and it opened up a whole spiritual journey for me. And I realized that it was showing up as a gift for me to explore who I had been prior to this diagnosis and learn about all of these things that we're talking about here, that I had far more agency in my own life and my own disease or
hell. Yes.
and my own health and all of the things. And it's still a practice on all these different fronts, but I just kind of keep taking it up and up and up in my own understanding about all the things we're talking about. And we have far more agency than most people even begin to give themselves credit for.
That's beautifully said. You said that very, very well. And what's interesting is once you kind of understand this, because I think you and I talked a little bit afterwards, and we've kind of had similar journeys in the sense that once you start recognizing, oh my gosh, there's things that I can do, and you think that you reach the level of understanding, right when you start to get about right here, it's like, oh, there's this much more. And you get about, oh, and when you start understanding, and this is where it sounds a little woo woo, and I used to joke about how I'm a recovering hippie. I did not mean to become like this. And I tell the clients all the time, I didn't start out this way. Okay. Over all these years, when you sit with people
Mhm.
and you take that they are expressing emotion, you feel it.
Mhm.
It is energy.
Mhm.
Emotions are energy. And when you start realizing, oh, wow, there's different frequencies of energies too. So there's an energy with shame. There's an energy with love, and they're very different. And I don't know if you saw this. I'm going to mention it because I thought it's pretty cool. I'm going to look into it more. But there was a study, and it's called SPANE, SPANE. They measure positive and negative energies, and they could measure the frequency of the energy leaving a person's body, and they could do, it was so good at measuring it, the subtle differences. They could distinguish energetically between someone experiencing despair and disdain. So, I mean, it was very fine too. And they found there was an emotional expression that put the highest frequency of positive energy out.
Mhm.
And you're like, well, what do you think it was? And everybody's like, love. It's got to be love. Love, that's got to be love.
Mhm.
And while love, obviously, it was one of the higher frequencies of energy coming out of the body, it wasn't the highest. Matter of fact, this one
Mhm.
is 4,000 times higher than love. And the answer was authenticity, being
Oh.
authentic. So it's like, okay, well, let me think about that. What does authentic mean? Authentic means that what you think, what you believe, and what you feel and how you express that are congruent. They're allowed to be congruent. If I was going to go sell a product and I didn't really believe in it, I mean, I could sell it and I could tell people and I could kind of try to appear hyped up, but it wouldn't be as authentic as if I believed it, I felt it, I believed in this. That's when we have the power to really affect others and to be very authentic and to put ourselves in a wonderful place of living in the highest frequency, one of the highest frequencies. That's so healthy for our bodies.
Right.
And so what happens though, is when you have chronic emotional pain that you keep shoving down. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it. And you push it down and you swallow it down and it gets stored in your body. That dam that I was talking about that gets built across your neck.
Yeah.
This and this gets separated because so much pain is here. It's impossible to be authentic.
Right.
The closest you'll get to authenticity, because you have to have this and this collectively working together. Chronic trauma, unresolved pain, keeps a dam across our neck, and this is separate. So you can't be connected for being authentic. And I will see people, they will come, the closest they can get to being authentic when they've got a lot of pain is in their shame. And they think they're horrible. They believe they're worthless. They feel that worthlessness. And that is where some of our illnesses, suicidal ideations,
Right.
where, I mean, and it's authentic because they think it, they feel it, they believe it.
Right.
And it's a very low amplified frequency and at the lowest level. And that's for dis-ease and pain and illness and suicidal ideations. All that stuff comes out of that space.
I did not know that in terms of shame being kind of married up authentically.
Not like a mirror. Yeah.
Wow, that's totally fascinating. So what I was thinking about, and I think you and I talked about this on the other side of our last conversation, was there's a business book, so I want y'all to hear this, called Who Not How, that's written by Dr. Benjamin Hardy in conjunction with Dan Sullivan, who is arguably one of the most world-renowned entrepreneurial coaches out there. And in that book, Dr. Benjamin Hardy is totally fascinated with consciousness. And so it marries up with what you're talking about. He references some work done on the mapping of consciousness and the frequencies that go with, shame all the way up to what they call enlightenment. So I can't wait to actually look at this study that you're talking about relative to authenticity in a shame place. So the way that I think about things is, okay, then they have as close to a marry up of their authenticity as possible. And if they can do that and feel that and know that, then they can elevate up into authenticity in a higher vibration. Is that true?
Yes, of course. Well, that's what you did. When you said to yourself, okay, I've been diagnosed with cancer. What lesson can I learn from this? How is this going to make me a stronger person? This is a blessing. I'm going to find the silver lining in this. That mindset is your mind working to make that happen and to be authentic and to drive the boat or to have agency, what you're saying, choosing a higher frequency agency. And like I said, I used to never talk about frequencies and energy. And I mean, I could pull it off when I'd speak in California, but I'd never say it in Texas, right?
No, right.
So it's become like my standard language now. And I kind of feel that way. I see it that way. And so many of my clients that, especially people that have been a lot of times diagnosed with a form of psychosis.
Yeah.
So often they are they're probably like in the 1 or 2, 3% where they're actually empaths. And they pick up frequencies that I can't see or hear. And just like a dog can hear frequencies I can't hear, birds can see colors that we can't see. So these little empaths are registering a lot of energy around them. And so when you start teaching them, it's actually a gift, but we've got to teach you how to harness that and manage it, because you become, it's like a lightning rod for all kinds of energy. And if you're not protected, you're going to bring in darker energy, and and most people say, well, I know if I tell people I hear voices or I see things, they'll think I'm crazy. So I just don't say it. But when I start explaining it to them as a gift, that it's like you've got to, kind of like Luke Skywalker had to go and get trained how to manage the force, right? And it can be a force for good or a force for bad. When you start helping people see as a gift, just that reframe, it creates agency, And and the relief that people have when they see it as a gift as opposed to a curse, that starts to become more of an authentic journey for them, because they're connecting to their worth and value instead of disconnecting from their worth and value. Because self-hate, I think, has a lot to do with like our autoimmune illnesses. Because hate of self. Now, I have to be careful. So audience, nobody freak out. This is where it gets difficult for folks. And I include myself. I'm not blaming anybody, because we don't know what we don't know. And when you try to start talking about how the way we perceive things can make us physically sick, people sometimes will say, well, you're blaming me for my illness. Only if you stay there and you don't allow yourself to grow. And I'm not blaming you at all, because we don't know what we don't know. It's taken me almost 4 decades to learn this stuff, right? And I'm in the field. So I don't blame anybody. But if you can shift it to, I didn't know that. I want to learn more about that, because if I can even remotely help myself mentally, physically, spiritually, even if it's 10%, I want to do what I can to make myself healthier. And I didn't realize I had agency to do so.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I just met with a senior C-suite exec yesterday, and the CEO is losing his shit. And this guy is in the C-suite, and we've moved to a point where we're able to talk about energy protection. And so I gave him a few tips, but one of the things I said to him was, you need to make sure your energy field is up. To keep his dark, negative energy over there. It's not going to penetrate. And that's not putting your armor on to keep yourself closed up. It's just a protective field so that you can be in the sage power that you own and have.
And see, these kinds of things, like I used to, like right now, I'm like, oh, cool, we're cut from the same cloth. But used to, I would think, oh, that's a little bit too woo-woo for me. But the more I am in this, you cannot sit with people in pain and help heal trauma without somehow becoming aware of energy and frequency. You just can't. Not if you're in this field. You start to absorb it yourself. You start to recognize it. You can see it in your clients, and then you start realizing, oh wow, the feelings I hold in, if those are energy, then that energy is going to tear up my body if I don't find a better way. So you start really making the connections, and it's like once you see it, you can't unsee it. And then you start thinking, just like what you said. How do you teach someone? We're not taught this in school. I mean, why are we not taught about because we have EKGs and EEGs that we stick on our body. There's electricity. It's picking up. We're electrical beings. I don't know why it's hard for people to consider we are energetic, and we actually have energy that comes out, and we take energy in. And so part of the work at Healing Springs is pay attention to what you put in your eyes. The energy, the frequency that you put in your eyes, you're just delivering it to your body. Pay attention to what you put in your ears. Pay attention to how you eat. Pay attention to the people you surround yourself with. And we even talk about intimacy and the energetic exchange with sexuality and intimacy. So I want to teach people, first of all, that they're energetic human beings. The way they process things has a direct bearing on the energy, the frequencies. We want to raise our frequency because this is where cells can heal themselves. We don't want to keep it low, because that's where dis-ease and low self-worth and illnesses are born. So we teach that here. And it's so funny because I never thought I'd be saying these things as a counselor, but I'm at a point now where you can't not say these things.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I personally cannot watch horror movies or really truly like trauma and drama movies.
Yes.
It just affects me energetically.
Yes.
My wife can watch them and doesn't appear to have any impact on her, but I am very sensitive to this stuff. And so, because of the work that I do, I need to keep my energy as clean as I possibly can and at vibrating at a higher level. And so I'm very protective of that. And so I know we're kind of in potentially a land that most people have maybe never considered. And we're just poking at this as something to explore.
Yes.
Because I didn't grow up with this, 60 some years ago. This wasn't, discussed. Um, it certainly wasn't in my counseling program.
Yeah, exactly.
you know, but the more that you choose to be what I would consider like a vigilant learner, and willing to listen to a lot of different people, you pick like the things that resonate with you and you move forward with those. And the other ones that don't, you leave them behind.
And just what you said about, I mean, because you're like the best positive reframe. You do a great job. I mean, I've heard it with your story with your kiddo. I hear it now with your story regarding your cancer. And being able to reframe things like that, that's a skill. You have to work at that. You have to practice it. And when you start shifting that, if you pay attention, you can feel the difference in your body when you change your mindset. Now, that's something you can teach your kids too. So this is what I teach the parents. And a lot of times when the kids are trying to explain to them on the phone, oh, we're learning about frequency. And then you're like, the parents will mention like, what are they talking about? So then you explain it and they're like, oh, so if we can start teaching our kids how to invoke that positive place, that's what I want to follow. That's the legacy I want to leave behind. And I mean, I'm just really learning it myself in the last 10 years since Healing Springs opened. That's really when I started really seeing this more and being able to put the words to it. And then I was amazed that it's kind of funny. The therapists and my friends will be like, I'll just kind of mention energy. And they're like, oh my gosh, you feel that way too. I'm afraid to say that to anybody, but that's exactly how I feel. So people are waking up, I think.
Yes, they are.
Starting to experience it.
Yes. To have energetic conversations with C-suite execs at this stage, that would not have happened 10 years ago. Whether I was thinking it and studying it or not, it wasn't showing up as much as it is now. And what I want to kind of highlight and give an exclamation point to, that notion of reframing, that is absolutely a skill set. It is not what I grew up with. And somewhere decades ago, I grabbed a hold of it and kept working it and working it and working it. And so I think that's one of the things for me that is so life affirming for those of us who love people that are dealing with substance use disorder, those of us who are struggling, period, in our lives, is that we can learn skills, and I call it skilling up, and we can be the kind of the drivers, the agency of our own life in ways, again, that most people don't recognize or don't know or whatever, but we can skill up in all these different ways and transform our lives.
Yes, absolutely agree. 100,000%. That's awesome. That is awesome. So I think we're talking about multi-generational. Let's start looking at these new patterns that we can teach our children. And back where you're saying that reframing piece, when I did the same thing, I made it a mental game to try to turn my negative thinking into positive. And it became a game. And I guarantee you, I didn't have an MRI done, but I guarantee you there were some parts of my brain that as I practiced that over and over, the pathway, that neuronal pathway was getting thicker and thicker and thicker to where I didn't have to work so hard at it. It just kind of would happen on its own. And I remember when I first started going to work, and I started doing this in high school. And so by the time I got my first job, I remember somebody there. So I went from being called a negative kid in high school. And then when I practiced this, I remember I did a group and the clients there said, we've all decided we're going to call you Pollyanna. And this is when I first got, and I thought, I have really come around. I have really turned this around because that was not what I was called before. So I'm living proof that you can change a negative mindset to a positive mindset. And it sounds like you are too.
Absolutely. I think just, to give somebody something tangible is like when something shows up that severely challenges you, I automatically think, okay, what are the gifts and lessons embedded in this experience for me? And that's definitely a Viktor Frankl thing, man's search for
Yes.
meaning.
Yes.
And so many people, and that's the thing is, who you read matters. Who you study with matters. They can help lift you up in what you're capable of. That's so much more than staying a negative Nelly or life sucks and then you die or blaming or anger
Yes.
or any of
Yes.
those, what I would say is kind of self-destructive ways of operating in the world.
For sure. And I actually did this because I led a group yesterday, and the clients actually get so fired up to hear this. They really enjoy hearing about it.
That's
And
awesome.
one of the things that I said to them, I said, I need to prepare you, because if you think you're going to get all this stuff at Healing Springs and you're going to leave and you're going to feel so wrapped up with the world when you leave, you need to know right now, when you walk out these doors, you will be going counterculture. If you embrace this lifestyle that I'm talking about, be a fish swimming upstream. Our world is the most toxic. We have more 10-year-olds that commit suicide. We have more serious chronic mental illness and addictions and overdoses and death than we've ever had. As long for hundreds of years. This is the most we've had. And you will have to be counterculture. So it's so important for you to find your tribe, your group of people that their goal is to keep themselves up here, to offer positive feedback, to always be thinking of how to reframe things. Most facilities talk about avoiding your triggers. We say triggers are your friend. We want to embrace those triggers because those are blessings in disguise. Those are opportunities to flex your emotional muscles, to actually kind of strain that and work through it, but to put it in a positive place. So what we're talking about is counterculture right now. And I feel like the world is starting to wake up more, and there's more people that see it, but we still have a tremendous amount of toxicity and dis-ease and discomfort and just mental malaise in this world right now.
Tremendously so. And I love that you use that language because I talk about countercultural all the time with my clients. And I do the same thing, just a little different because I'm in the business world, but it's like who you surround yourself with is who you become. Who you read is who you become. Who you listen to is who you become. What movies you watch is who you become. And so you have to be super, super, super on top of your game about who you choose to surround yourself with and listen to.
You have an obligation. You can't just kind of accidentally stumble around life. You are obligated for your own well-being and health, to surround yourself and to put positive things in. I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, Melissa, you and I could talk all day quite easily. And so I love where this conversation, when we got on earlier, we're kind of like, well, what do I want to talk about? And we're just like, well, let's just go. And this has been super rich. That's how I feel about it. So many important things for our audience to consider, to do some research around, to find books, to find people that are in this space. Explore.
Yes.
Please explore. It's never necessary to just be where you are.
There's always room for growth. Absolutely.
There's always room for growth. Yeah. So again, if people want to reach out to you, how can they reach you? And I just can't even begin to say how grateful I am that we have been connected and that you are doing the work that you're doing in the world.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, so we are a Healing Spring branch, and we are an addiction facility. So we treat all kinds of addictions, whether it's substances or codependency or porn or even food. So we address any kind of addictive pattern. And you can look us up and learn about us on healingspringsranch.com and learn all about our program. And if it's an opportunity or you have a loved one or yourself that needs to be able to get away to get to the root of these addictive cycles, and you've already heard a lot of the philosophy that we share and what we teach here at Healing Springs, feel free to call us.
Super. Well, again, thank you. I adore you.
Welcome.
You're a light in the world.
Well, ditto.
Yeah. So everybody, listen to this one again. This is worth it. And skill up.
Thank you.